Okay, I think yep, okay. So the next part talks about the history of special education, and I am not going to go into all of these in depth because you don't really need to understand all of them, but you do need to know that early on in history, they started noticing that there were people that were not typical in comparison to others their age, and so we start all the way back here at the late 18th century, mid 19th history. We started to have some procedures for how to teach difficult students. And then in the 1800s, we started opening schools for children with disabilities. So the first two that were opened were schools for the blind and schools for the deaf. And those are now the only schools that still stand that are specific to disabilities that are not charter schools. So each state has public schools that are funded through the state that are residential schools for students who are blind or deaf. So we have Kentucky School for the Blind and Kentucky School for the Deaf here in Kentucky, obviously. But then in the 20th century, we started really talking about normalization and deinstitutionalization, because before then, if you had a disability, they tried to put you almost in like a mental hospital, and they put a lot of people with disabilities in an institution where they were taken care of in the medical world and taken away from their families, taken away from society, and they pretty much lived in a hospital of sorts. And we started breaking that barrier down in the 20th century. We went from deinstitutionalization to inclusion, which are sort of different. We said, we don't believe that you belong in a residential facility, but we don't really have a place for you in the classroom. And we sort of moved towards inclusion, where we said, you know what, there are opportunities for you to come in the general education classroom with other students. And there's this video that I would like you to watch. So when you're finished with the narrated version of this PowerPoint, you can watch that video. I don't want to do that because I think it's about 8 minutes. We also want to talk about the fact that there's a lot of organizations that started to pop up for people with disabilities. So one is an organization that's been around for a long time. It's called the Council for Exceptional Children, or for short, it's called the CEC. And we still have a very strong CEC. So in Thanksgiving, around the week of Thanksgiving every year, there's a Kentucky CEC conference that I typically attend. It's really great. But they have been around for a long, long time. They do a lot of great research, and it is just a great organization. And then there's a lot of parent groups. Those started popping up in the 50s, and they provide a lot of support and information. And then we have other organizations like the Special Olympics, and those help just have a place for people with disabilities, and they also advocate for people with disabilities. So, like I mentioned before, I am part of the International Dyslexia Association, and so we work with students that have dyslexia and help parents, and we help advocate for new legislation. And so there's just a ton of organizations that I'm sure that you've heard about, but those are things that have been supported and been founded for quite a long time in history. And then a lot of what our schools do are based on laws. And if something is not working, sometimes parents or school systems will go through a thing called due process, or sometimes they'll go through litigation and they'll sue. So there's a lot of cases that brought about big changes for students with exceptionalities. One of them right here is the Brown versus Board of Education, and Brown was a family member, and so I put those in red because I want you to really understand that a lot of times when legislation happens, it's because a parent was upset that their child wasn't receiving the services that they needed, and therefore they sued the county or the school district or the state or something like that. So Brown versus Board of Education we talk about a lot in history, because to us it was a desegregation law. But it also meant that we can't exclude people with disabilities. So Brown versus Board of Education said we have to include and give everybody an equal opportunity to receive education. You cannot discriminate based on color, based on ability, et cetera, et cetera. So Brown versus Board of Education was very pivotal for people with exceptionalities as well as people of color at the time. And then there's all sorts of other things. So this one talks about that the way that the Washington, D.C. schools were tracking was not a very valid way to do it. So they could put students in special education classes, but they shouldn't be tracked based on the classes that they were in. This one is saying that we have to give a student an evaluation in their primary language. So if we suspect a child has a specific learning disability and their primary language is Spanish and we assess them in English, of course, they might show that they have a disability, but it could perhaps be a language barrier instead of a disability. So we have to use their primary language when we're assessing them. And then we have Park versus Pennsylvania, and that is saying we can't exclude students from public education. Then we have the 504 Act, which came about, and that helped give people the rights for employment. And then we had all sorts of other things. Public education needed to be given. Let's see, you can't only use IQ scores to base where the student should be placed. So sometimes in school, when we do assessments, we'll say, oh, this child has an IQ of 54, which is pretty low. So we might say, oh, he has an IQ of a 54. He should probably be in a self-contained classroom. They are saying we can't just look at an IQ score. We have to look at the whole child. Would he benefit from being in a regular classroom? I don't really care what his IQ score is. Let's look at what he can do, what are his strengths, and would he benefit in classrooms? So we can't base his placement just off of a score. And then more recently, in 88, I mean, heck, I was born by then, so we'll call that recent, we say that we can't exclude anybody for a misbehavior if it's disability related. And so that sort of talks about manifestation of determination, and we'll talk about that later on in the semester. And then we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, there is a difference between Americans with Disabilities Act, which is ADA, and then IDEA. So ADA covers everybody with a disability. It's saying we cannot discriminate against people with disabilities, where IDEA just covers educationally based things. So ADA protects everybody, and then IDEA is an extra layer in terms of education. We've got No Child Left Behind, which means that we need to give all students a high quality teacher. Even students that need special education services have the right to have a highly qualified teacher. And then here's the IDEA that I was talking about. So this sort of adds provisions to ADA and to No Child Left Behind. And it says, gives them all sorts of extra services. So in your book and on the discussion board this week, you're going to talk about the different aspects of IDEA that were put in and vital to students with exceptionality. So that's on page 14. And it includes things like free appropriate education, confidentiality, least restrictive environment, all sorts of great stuff. And you'll read that again and discuss that. And then let's see. This one is just another one that a parent said that their child wasn't getting appropriate education, and they want it. Obviously, they got a whole lot of money from it. So your book goes into detail, and if you're interested in that, you can go back and reread that. I just want you to get the idea that there's lots of litigation that brings upon change to public school systems, and it's ultimately because the parent was not happy with the way that the child was being serviced in the school system. The major provisions of IDEA, like I said, you're going to do that on the discussion board, but you can read about it again on page 14, the chart on page 14. But it talks about different things like least restrictive environment. So what is the best setting for the child for his needs, but also to be included with his gen ed peers. There should be continuation of services. So when they go from elementary to middle, middle to high, high to adulthood, we need to make sure that we're continuing the services that they've received to help them be successful. We have zero reject, we have due process. Due process is saying, if a parent disagrees, we have to allow them a chance to say that they disagree. We have to give a fair evaluation, an IEP plan if the child qualifies. We have to make sure that you keep confidentiality, so it's sort of like HIPAA, but for education. The students should get a high qualified teacher. And then procedural safeguards is another one we'll talk about later on in this semester, but it's a very in-depth article or document that gives rights to the parents if they have a child with a disability. So just make sure you review page 14, and I know that you're going to discuss this, so I don't want to talk about it too much here. When we talk about admitting a child for special education, we have to once again make sure that they have a federally recognized disability, and there's 13 categories for that. And then they have to demonstrate a need that they need special education in order to achieve. So just like I said on the first video, just because you have a disability does not mean you need special ed. So you have to show that your disability mandates the need of special education to achieve. These are different categories that you might qualify for disability. One is specific learning disabilities, and that actually has 8 little subsections under it. So it could be basic math, math calculation, basic reading, reading fluency, written expression, reading comprehension, there's lots of them. Dyslexia falls under that as well. Speech language impairments is another one that's really popular, or we would say a high incidence. Mental retardation has recently changed to an intellectual disability, and that is a low IQ or cognitive functioning. And then we have serious emotional disturbance, which we also call EBD, a lot of times an emotional behavior disorder. You have other health impairments. That's sort of the umbrella term for a lot of different health impairments, including ADHD, but it could also mean that you have rheumatoid arthritis or diabetes or something like that. Multiple disabilities means that you have 2 or more of these different categories that require different service providers. You have hearing impairment, which would be deaf, orthopedic impairment, and that is, like my example on the first slide, if you're born without use of some part of your body, or you have an impairment to some part of your body, that would be an orthopedic impairment. Visual impairment is blind. Deaf blindness is a different one. So there's not a lot of students that have deaf blindness, but historically that was its own category. So it will probably always stay as a disability category. And then we have traumatic brain injury, autism, and developmental delay. So those are the different categories that a student with disability would likely fall under. And then finally, we always conclude with reasons for optimism. So there's lots of teachers and professionals who care about students with exceptionalities, and they make it their life to help students with disabilities be the best that they can be. And we are very thankful for that. And then there's a lot of scientific advances, so we are starting to see early on, even prenatally, that there's a potential for disability, and sometimes we can intervene in utero. So like spina bifida, you can now do surgeries in utero to remove some of the tumors and hope that by the time the baby's born, they have no differences in their functionality of life. And there's tons of scientific advances happening. We also are able to prevent some disabilities because of some advances, and then we also have more medical advances towards treatments or cures to help either cure what's going on or remediate it. So you may not necessarily ever cure ADHD, but there's medications in place that might help some people with ADHD remediate that impulsivity. And so scientific advances are sort of helping, in a way, students with exceptionalities. Now, there's lots of other ways that we might say medical advances are hindering it, but for the most part, a lot of times our medical advances are to help our children with exceptionalities have the best possible quality of life that they can. So that's really it for Chapter 1 in a nutshell in terms of what I can explain to you. If you have any questions, you know that you are always welcome to send me an email or stop in my office. And I wish you the best this week.